Floyd Myers Jr. dead at 42. Fresh Prince star's shocking end. The night before it happened, Floyd Roger Meyers Jr. called his mother. The conversation was ordinary, maybe too ordinary. There were no hints of finality in his voice, no tremor that might betray what was to come. Just laughter, plans, the kind of easy back and forth only a mother and son can share. Hours later, the house in Maryland would fall silent, except for the faint echo of a tragedy no one could have predicted. In the world's eyes, Floyd was the kid who once was Will Smith. The wide-eyed boy from the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, frozen forever in that 1992 flashback episode. But the man he became, the father, the mentor, the quiet force behind a movement helping men heal that story, was far more profound. And yet, it ended suddenly. At 42, Floyd's heart simply gave out. A heart that had already broken and healed 3 times before a body that had survived against odds few ever could. His passing wasn't just the end of a life. It was the abrupt closing of a chapter Hollywood had long forgotten, and the opening of a conversation about the hidden pain carried by men who give everything to help others. In the coming minutes, we'll step into Floyd's world from the lights of a 1,990-second sitcom set to the quiet streets of Maryland, where he built something extraordinary. This isn't just the story of a fallen actor. It's a story about purpose, pressure, and the fragile heartbeat of a man who tried to save others while fighting his own invisible war. Welcome to the final footage. This is Floyd Myers Jr., the Fresh Prince star's shocking end. Before tragedy came calling, Floyd Roger Meyers Jr. lived a life defined not by fame, but by purpose. To many who met him in his later years, he wasn't that kid from Fresh Prince. He was a leader, a listener, a man whose presence had a calming gravity. He had that rare quality. When Floyd spoke, you wanted to listen, not because he was loud or charismatic in the Hollywood sense, but because he spoke with empathy, with understanding that came from both pain and wisdom. Born in the early 1980 seconds, Floyd grew up in an era where television heroes looked like possibility, and at just 9 years old, he became one of them. In 1992, he stepped onto the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air set to play a young Will Smith in the flashback episode, Will Gets Committed. For a child, it was like walking into the heart of pop culture itself. The laughter, the cameras, the rhythm of the audience, it was magic. And Floyd, by all accounts, absorbed it completely. He didn't just mimic Will Smith's expressions. He became that younger version, radiating the same spark that made the show iconic. For a brief moment, it looked like the beginning of something unstoppable. His performance caught attention quickly within months. He was cast as young Marlon Jackson in The Jacksons, An American Dream, sharing the screen with the likes of Angela Bassett and Vanessa Williams. The world was open, bright, full of promise. But somewhere along the way, Floyd saw something most child actors never do: the illusion behind the light. He recognized early that fame wasn't freedom. It was weight. It asked for more than it gave back. By the time he reached his late teens, Floyd began to pull away from Hollywood, quietly stepping out of the spotlight before it could consume him. His last on-screen credit came in 2000. And then, silence. To outsiders, it might have looked like a disappearance, another child star lost to the void of whatever happened to. But inside that silence, something beautiful was forming. Floyd wasn't lost. He was becoming. He spent the next 2 decades rebuilding his life in Maryland, not as a celebrity, but as a man on a mission. While many were chasing relevance, Floyd was searching for meaning. That search would eventually lead him to co-found the Fellowship Men's Group, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping men confront their mental, emotional, and spiritual wounds. He saw a truth most of society ignored. Men were hurting, often silently, carrying burdens they didn't know how to name. Floyd wanted to give them space to breathe again, to talk, to feel, to heal. He often said that his purpose wasn't to teach but to listen. And those who knew him said he was the kind of man who could sit in a room full of pain and somehow make everyone feel safe. He was the steady presence at the center of storms. His family worried. His close friends urged him to slow down, to take care of himself. But Floyd always deflected concern with a smile and a promise. "I'm good. I've got this." Maybe he believed it. Maybe he needed to. Because in his mind, there was still so much work to do, so many men to reach, So many lives to help heal. And then came the night of October 28th, 2024, the final normal night. Floyd called his mother, Renee Trice, like he always did. They talked about the kids, about his next men's group meeting. There was no darkness in his voice, no sense of looming tragedy. Just plans. Just love. Hours later, the world that Floyd had built, the family he adored, the mission he carried would be forever changed. It began like any other day, the kind of day that feels routine, safe, almost forgettable. For Floyd Roger Meyers Jr., October 29th, 2024, should have been one of those ordinary days that blend into the rhythm of life. The kind where you wake up to the sound of kids getting ready for school, sunlight creeping through half-closed blinds, the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. The kind where nothing bad ever feels possible. But that's the cruel trick of fate, it never announces itself. That morning, Floyd's Maryland home was quiet. His children were gone for the day, his phone buzzing occasionally with messages from the fellowship team. They were planning their next weekend meeting, a gathering Floyd was particularly excited about. He had ideas for a new theme, something about reclaiming strength through vulnerability. It was a concept he'd been talking about for weeks, one that had the men in his circle deeply moved. He spent the early hours replying to messages, updating schedules, and checking in on members who were struggling. That was who Floyd was, even when his own body was betraying him. His first instinct was always to take care of someone else. By mid-morning, he went about his day as usual. He took a brief walk around his neighborhood, something he did often since his last heart attack. The cool October air filled his lungs, leaves skittered across the pavement, their dry whispers brushing against his sneakers. Neighbors waved. He smiled back. Easy and familiar. No one could have guessed that this would be the last time they'd see that smile. Later, he returned home, likely tired but content. He'd told his sister recently that he was feeling better, that his doctors were keeping an eye on things. But beneath that reassurance, his body was a quiet battlefield. His heart, weakened by years of strain and silent warning signs, was working harder than it should have been. Afternoon faded into evening. The sun dipped low, throwing amber light across his living room. Floyd picked up his phone again, maybe texting his mother, maybe scrolling through updates from the fellowship's social page. Around 9 p.m., he settled in for the night. His last call, as far as anyone knows, was to his mom, Renee. Their conversation was normal, a simple exchange of warmth between mother and son. "I love you," she might have said. "I love you too," he'd reply. There's something haunting about that kind of ordinary exchange, how it can hold the weight of finality without either person realizing it. Somewhere in the early morning hours of October 29th, Floyd's body began to give way. Cardiac arrest doesn't wait. It doesn't ask for permission or offer warning. One moment, you're alive the next. Your body is drowning in silence. It's believed that Floyd suffered a massive heart attack, his fourth in 3 years. Alone in his Maryland home, the same house where laughter once filled every room, his heart simply stopped. What's most tragic is how quickly it must have happened. Doctors say that with multiple prior cardiac events, even a small disruption can become catastrophic. For Floyd, whose heart had already fought back 3 times, the fourth strike was too much. When his mother didn't hear from him the next morning, she thought little of it at first. Floyd was busy meetings, calls, kids, endless responsibilities. But as hours passed, something began to feel wrong. It's a feeling only a mother can describe, that deep, instinctive dread that crawls into your chest when silence replaces routine. She tried calling. No answer. Texts went unread. Then came the knock on the door that every parent dreads. The details of what followed remain private, out of respect for his family. But what's known is this. Sometime that morning, Floyd's body was found in his home. Emergency responders confirmed what no one wanted to believe: he was gone. Word traveled fast among his loved ones. Within hours, the fellowship men's group, the very community he helped create, was in disbelief. Messages poured in. Phone lines buzzed. Men who had once leaned on Floyd for emotional strength now found themselves breaking under the weight of his loss. By noon, his mother's home was filled with family. His sister, Tyree, collapsed in tears when she got the call. She couldn't comprehend how someone who seemed to have survived so much, who'd come back from the edge 3 times, could be gone for good. In those first few hours, time lost its meaning. There were only fragments, phone calls, sobs, flashes of memory. His mother replaying their last conversation in her head, over and over again, searching for clues. Had his voice sounded tired? Was there a pause too long to notice? Was there something she could have heard but didn't? Grief often starts with confusion that split second when reality bends and your mind refuses to accept the truth. That's how it began for Floyd's family. The man they had known as unbreakable, the heart that had carried so many others, had finally stopped. Outside, the world moved on. Morning traffic flowed as usual. Children walked to school. The hum of everyday life continued, unaware that a quiet home in Maryland had just lost its center. That day marked the end of a life, and the beginning of a ripple that would move through his community, his family, and his fans. For those who knew him, Floyd's death wasn't just another headline, it was a cruel reminder that even those who help others heal sometimes carry pain too deep to see. When the shock began to settle, the silence that followed Floyd's death felt almost unbearable. Grief does strange things to perception. Every sound becomes sharper, every pause heavier, and every question begins with why. Why him? Why now? How could someone so devoted to life, to healing, to others, suddenly be gone? In most deaths, especially those as sudden as this, there are always questions, and for the Meyers family, there were many. The official cause was cardiac arrest, but it was hard to accept how a 42-year-old man could lose a battle he had already fought 3 times and won. Floyd's life had been an ongoing conversation between resilience and fragility, and now that conversation had ended without warning. Local authorities began what they called a routine death investigation. It wasn't criminal. There were no signs of foul play. But because of Floyd's age and public recognition, the process was meticulous. Paramedics, medical examiners, and investigators all worked together to ensure the facts were clear. Inside his home, the scene told a story of quiet normalcy. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of self-harm, no indications of anything sinister. On the nightstand beside his bed sat his phone, its screen lighting up occasionally with missed calls from his mother and sister. A glass of water, a book, the small, human details that tell us life was lived right up until it wasn't. The medical examiner confirmed what Floyd's family already feared: a massive myocardial infarction, a fatal heart attack that struck in the early hours. There was nothing anyone could have done, no call that could have been made in time. His heart, weakened by repeated trauma, had simply stopped responding. Yet, even knowing this, closure felt impossible. In the days that followed, investigators gathered medical records, spoke with his physicians, and reviewed any recent signs of distress. They learned that Floyd had been managing chronic cardiac disease, a condition made worse by stress and years of overexertion. Though he'd made progress, healthier habits, consistent medication, careful monitoring, his schedule was relentless. Between raising 4 children, managing the fellowship men's group, and balancing his health, Floyd was, in many ways, burning the candle from both ends. His doctor later told the family something that stuck with them. Floyd was living with a heart that had already been through more than most men his age could survive. It was both a testament to his strength and a tragic omen that none of them had wanted to hear. But beyond the medical findings, the investigation revealed something deeper, something emotional, almost existential. In interviews with friends and colleagues, investigators heard a recurring theme. Floyd had been tired, not in the physical sense alone, but in spirit. He had seen too much pain through his work, men struggling with depression, broken families, generational trauma, and he carried their stories like invisible weight. He was the kind of man who absorbed the hurt of others, often without realizing it. Members of the fellowship described him as a rock, the person everyone called when their own world felt too heavy. But even rocks erode under constant storms. Behind the calm smile and words of encouragement, Floyd was fighting a war few could see, one between his desire to serve and his body's desperate need for rest. Authorities pieced together the timeline. His last call with his mother, his activity online, the time his heart likely failed. There was no crime, no malice, only a man whose body had quietly reached its end. Still, for his loved ones, the investigation's conclusion didn't make it easier. Sometimes, the absence of wrongdoing doesn't erase the sense of injustice. Meanwhile, the story began to spread. Entertainment outlets caught wind of the news. Former Fresh Prince child star dead at 42. The headlines felt clinical, detached, reducing a complex, beautiful life to a footnote of fame. That was something his family struggled with deeply. Floyd had spent years building a new identity beyond Hollywood, yet the first thing people saw in his death was the kid from TV. As investigators closed their report, the focus shifted from how Floyd died to why his loss mattered. The Fellowship Men's Group organized a gathering, not a funeral yet, but a vigil. It was held in a small community center, the same place where Floyd had once led workshops on vulnerability and healing. Detectives attended, too quietly, respectfully. They saw what their reports couldn't capture: the impact of one man's life. Dozens of men stood in a circle, candles flickering in their hands. One by one, they spoke of how Floyd had changed them, not with grand gestures, but with simple, consistent kindness. "I came here broken," one said. "And Floyd, he didn't try to fix me. He just listened until I could hear myself again." For the investigators, it was a rare kind of closure, not the kind measured in evidence or reports, but in human connection. The case was over, but the story of who Floyd was had only begun to unfold in the people he'd left behind. As the investigation officially closed, the family faced another difficult chapter: the public announcement. Press inquiries flooded in, social media accounts lit up, and rumors started to swirl. Some speculated about drugs, others about exhaustion, but those who truly knew him shut all that noise down quickly. Floyd had not been reckless. He had not given up. He had lived fully, and his body had simply reached its breaking point. When the final report came in, stamped, signed, and filed away, it offered facts but no peace. The truth, as it often is in stories like this, was heartbreakingly simple. A man whose purpose was to mend broken hearts was lost to the very thing he tried to protect in others. Sometimes, in tragedy, the breakthrough isn't about discovering how someone died, it's about uncovering why their life mattered so deeply. For Floyd Roger Meyers Jr., that breakthrough came not through an autopsy report or police statement, but through the collective awakening of the people he left behind. In the days following his death, Maryland's autumn skies were gray and heavy, the kind of weather that seemed to mirror the mood of everyone who knew him. The community that Floyd had poured his heart into, the Fellowship Men's Group, found itself at a crossroads. The man who had been their anchor was gone. For many of them, Floyd wasn't just a mentor. He was the embodiment of second chances. And now, without him, they were forced to confront the question he had asked them so many times in their sessions. Who are you when life breaks you open? That question became the beginning of the breakthrough. In the week after Floyd's passing, his closest friend and co-founder, a man named Marcus Big Bro Hall, gathered the group for what he called one last meeting for Floyd. Dozens of men showed up. Some had driven from neighboring states. Others called off work. A few simply appeared in silence, unsure of how to process the loss. They met in the same room Floyd had always used, simple, warm, and lined with folding chairs arranged in a circle. The air smelled faintly of coffee and candle wax. On the center table sat a framed photo of Floyd, smiling, with his kids around him. Marcus stood at the front of the room and began to speak, his voice trembling at first. "We came here to learn how to be better men. Floyd showed us that didn't mean being perfect, it meant being present. He gave us this space, this brotherhood. So if you're asking what we do now that he's gone, we keep going. We finish what he started." That moment was the emotional turning point. The men went around the room, sharing stories, moments that revealed the quiet, transformative power Floyd had in their lives. One man talked about how Floyd had helped him confront suicidal thoughts after a divorce. Another said that Floyd's honesty about his own struggles gave him permission to finally see a therapist. Others described him as the first person who'd ever made them feel safe enough to cry. By the end of the meeting, the room was filled with a kind of sacred silence, the kind that only comes when pain begins to turn into purpose. But the breakthrough didn't stop there. Behind the scenes, Floyd's sister Tyree was organizing the family's affairs, setting up a GoFundMe to help support his 4 children: Talon, Kinsley, Tyler, and Knox. When she wrote the campaign description, her words struck a chord that rippled far beyond their Maryland community. Floyd was more than an actor, more than a brother, father, or friend. He was a healer. He gave everything he had to help others find peace, even while his own heart was breaking. The post spread quickly across social media. Fans who hadn't heard Floyd's name in decades suddenly remembered him, the boy from the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, that flash of youthful charm and energy. But as they read more about the life he'd lived since, they realized his true legacy wasn't on a TV screen. It was in the lives he'd quietly transformed. Soon, news outlets began picking up the story, but this time, not as a celebrity obituary. The tone shifted. Headlines began to read, "Former Fresh Prince actor turned mental health advocate dies at 42. Floyd Meyers Jr. From child star to healer. Floyd Meyers Jr. Floyd Meyers Jr. The public was finally seeing him the way his family always had. Within 2 weeks, donations poured into the GoFundMe. Strangers left messages filled with gratitude and reflection. I didn't know him, but this story moved me. As a man who struggles with heart disease, this hit home. His work mattered, it still does. This outpouring of love and support became a revelation for Renee and Tyree. For so long, they'd felt that Floyd's story had been forgotten, his contributions, unseen. Now, people across the country were not only remembering him, but learning from him. His death, as devastating as it was, had reignited conversations about men's health, both mental and physical. Doctors and wellness coaches began sharing his story on podcasts and community pages, using it to highlight a painful truth. Heart disease remains one of the leading causes of death among men under 45, and the signs often go ignored, especially by those who spend their lives caring for others. In that sense, Floyd's passing became more than a personal tragedy. It became a wake-up call. His life became a case study in compassion, resilience, and the cost of emotional labor. The men he had once counseled began organizing new events under the fellowship banner. This time focused not only on mental wellness, but on heart health awareness. They invited speakers, partnered with doctors, and even hosted blood pressure screenings at their meetings. In a single profound act of collective healing, they transformed loss into legacy. The family felt it too. Renee often said she could feel her son's presence in those gatherings, as if he was still there, smiling from a corner seat, proud of the work continuing in his name. By the time his memorial service was announced, the world seemed ready to listen. People weren't just mourning a forgotten actor anymore, they were honoring a man who had dared to redefine success, who walked away from fame to find meaning in service. For the first time since his death, Renee and Tyree began to feel that the story of Floyd's life had broken through the noise of grief. His message was being heard again, louder, clearer, and more alive than ever. And that was the true breakthrough. Not in the evidence, but in the echo. The realization that Floyd's heart, though it had stopped beating, was still changing lives with every story told in his name. In most true crime stories, this section is about the pursuit of a suspect, the chase, the confession, the justice that follows. But in Floyd's story, there was no villain to arrest, no confession to extract under the cold glare of interrogation lights. The only culprit was invisible, a failing heart, worn down by time, by stress, by the emotional toll of carrying others through their darkest moments. And yet, even without a perpetrator, this part of Floyd's story still held a kind of reckoning, a moment of confrontation, not in a police station, but within the hearts of those he left behind. Because sometimes, the hardest confession to make isn't to another person, it's to yourself. For Floyd's mother, Renee, that reckoning came in waves. In the quiet after the funeral, she found herself moving through her son's home, carefully touching the objects he'd left behind. The framed photos, the children's drawings taped to the fridge, the journals he kept stacked beside his bed. In one of those journals, she found something that would change how she understood her son's final months. It wasn't a note or farewell, it was a reflection. Pages filled with thoughts about purpose, fatigue, gratitude, and fear. Floyd had written about his health, about how hard it was to slow down, how guilty he felt for saying no to people who needed him. I keep telling the brothers in fellowship to rest, he wrote, but I don't know how to do that myself. Every time I stop, I think of someone out there who might need to hear something, a word, a truth, a hug, and I get back up again. Maybe I'm afraid that if I stop, the work will stop too. Reading those words was like hearing him speak from somewhere just beyond reach. It was raw honesty, his own quiet confession. He knew his limits. He just couldn't accept them. For the men of the fellowship, that same realization came during their first meeting after the memorial. Marcus Big Bro Hall stood before the group and said, "We all wanted to save Floyd. We wanted to help him rest, slow down. But maybe the way we honor him now is by finally doing what he couldn't by taking care of ourselves too." 2. That moment became a kind of emotional arrest, a confrontation with the truth that many men avoid. That strength isn't measured in how much you can carry, but in how much you can let go. Still, grief has a way of looking for somewhere to place the pain. For a time, some of Floyd's loved ones couldn't help but feel angry. Not at a person, but at a system. Why hadn't his doctors done more? Why hadn't the hospital caught it earlier? How could someone who spent years saving lives not have his own life saved in time? Those questions led the family to meet with his primary care physician, a man who had been treating Floyd since his second heart attack. He sat with Renee and Tyree, gentle but honest, explaining that Floyd's condition had been manageable, not curable. "He fought harder than most patients ever do," the doctor said softly. "We adjusted his medications, he changed his diet, he exercised. But every heart has a limit. His had simply reached it." Renee nodded, tears streaming silently. She didn't blame the doctor, not really, but hearing that finality out loud, the words, "his heart had reached its limit," was its own kind of sentence. In many ways, this was the confession the story demanded not from a killer, but from life itself. The truth that sometimes, no matter how good a person is, no matter how much light they bring, time still claims its due. The family began to talk openly about those feelings. They decided to share Floyd's journal entries not publicly, but within the fellowship. The men listened as Renee read his words aloud, her voice trembling on lines where he'd written about fatherhood, about faith, about wanting to leave the world softer than he found it. In that room, something shifted. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was reverent, as if everyone there understood that this was the moment Floyd's truth was finally being spoken into the world. Afterward, Marcus approached Renee and said, "This was his confession, Mrs. Trice. He wasn't afraid to die. He was afraid to stop living for others." That struck her deeply because it was true. Floyd's compassion had always bordered on self-sacrifice. And while that made him extraordinary, it also made him vulnerable. As weeks turned into months, the family's pain began to settle into purpose. The fellowship officially renamed one of their programs the Floyd Meyers Heart Initiative, a series dedicated to emotional resilience and physical health awareness for men. They partnered with local clinics to provide screenings, counseling, and mentorship, everything Floyd had wanted to expand before his death. When Renee saw the first flyers printed with her son's face, smiling above the words, "Healing begins with the heart," she finally exhaled. It felt like justice not in a courtroom sense, but in the way Floyd would have wanted. His work wasn't ending. It was evolving. In the narrative of a true crime, the arrest and confession often mark the beginning of closure. Here, they symbolize something far more intimate: acceptance. The realization that not every story of loss is about punishment or blame, but about acknowledgement and continuation. Because the truth was simple and deeply human. Floyd's body had failed him, but his message, his heart had not. And in the end, that was the confession every soul in his orbit needed to hear. That he'd given all he could, loved as fiercely as he lived, and left behind a blueprint for how to keep going, even after he was gone. The days following Floyd's passing felt disjointed, like the world itself had lost its rhythm. For those closest to him, time became elastic, stretching endlessly through nights of restless thought, then snapping tight in flashes of grief that took their breath away. His home in Maryland, once filled with laughter, now stood as a quiet museum of memories. His children's toys still sat in the corners of rooms. A pair of sneakers near the door waited for an owner who would never return. On the kitchen counter, a coffee mug half finished, still carrying a faint ring, remained untouched for weeks. These small, ordinary objects became symbols of the extraordinary absence left behind. For Renee, every morning began the same way. She would sit at her son's table, sunlight filtering through thin curtains, and whisper, "Good morning, baby," as if he were still upstairs getting ready for work. Grief, she learned, was not loud or cinematic. It was subtle. It lived in the pauses between tasks. the quiet moments when she expected to hear his voice. But Floyd's story didn't fade in silence, not this time. The Fellowship Men's Group stepped into the spotlight, unwilling to let their co-founder's message die with him. At their first public memorial, over 200 men gathered in the local community center, teachers, fathers, coaches, construction workers, each one touched in some way by Floyd's work. Candles lined the stage, flickering beneath a photo of him smiling, his arms folded, eyes gleaming with that same spark viewers once saw in the Fresh Prince flashback scene. But this was not Hollywood lighting. This was human light, raw, unfiltered, full of gratitude and ache. Marcus Hall stood before the crowd, voice trembling as he spoke. Floyd told us that healing wasn't a finish line, it was a rhythm. You fall, you rise, you talk, you breathe. He didn't just teach us how to be men. He taught us how to be whole. That night, men who had never spoken publicly before shared their stories. They talked about depression, divorce, fatherhood, fear, and through their words, you could feel Floyd's presence not as a memory, but as momentum. Meanwhile, Floyd's sister Tyree poured her grief into action. She launched the GoFundMe campaign that quickly spread beyond Maryland, gathering thousands of supporters, fans who remembered his childhood performances, and strangers who connected to his mission. The messages that came in were hauntingly consistent. He helped me when I didn't believe in myself. He made me want to be a better father. He reminded me that real men can cry. Every donation felt like a collective heartbeat, proof that the life he built outside Hollywood had resonated deeply. The national media eventually caught up. Headlines framed him as the forgotten Fresh Prince star. And while the exposure brought attention, those closest to Floyd felt conflicted. They appreciated the recognition, but they also knew the story wasn't about nostalgia or lost fame. It was about what came after. When news outlets asked Renee for interviews, she hesitated. The world, she felt, had already written enough stories about actors gone too soon. What she wanted was to rewrite the narrative to remind people that her son's legacy wasn't tragedy, but transformation. He wasn't just a boy who played young Will Smith, she told one reporter. He was a man who played himself authentically, humbly, and fully. And that role, no one could do better. Those words struck a chord online. Tributes flooded social media not just from fans, but from men's wellness organizations, nonprofits, and even former cast members who remembered his bright energy on set. The digital wave became a modern vigil, lighting up timelines across the country with his smile. But even as the tributes grew, the family's private grief deepened. Floyd's children, Talon, Kinsley, Tyler, and Knox, each processed it differently. Talon, the oldest, took on the quiet protector role, making sure his siblings were okay before himself. Kinsley asked the hardest questions. Why did Daddy's heart stop if he was helping other people's hearts? There was no easy answer, only gentle reassurances that love sometimes burns so bright, it simply runs out of space to hold itself. In time, the Fellowship transformed that pain into purpose. They launched a new campaign under Floyd's name, a Men's Health Awareness Week focused on heart wellness and emotional resilience. Hospitals began partnering with the group. Local radio stations hosted segments on the intersection of stress, masculinity, and mortality. In just months, Floyd's death began to spark life in others, a paradox that somehow felt fitting. Detectives and reporters who had initially covered his passing as a former child star's sudden death began to revisit the story, reframing it through a more human lens. What started as a tragic headline evolved into a case study in community impact, how one man's quiet mission could ripple beyond his own lifespan. But for his family, the aftermath remained deeply personal. On the first Christmas without him, Renee gathered everyone in the living room. They watched the Fresh Prince episode that had introduced Floyd to the world. There he was, 9 years old, full of energy, mimicking Will Smith's grin with uncanny perfection. For a few moments, the room filled with laughter through tears. Renee turned to her grandchildren and said softly, "See that boy? That's your daddy. And you know what? He never stopped being that boy even when he grew up. He just learned to give his joy away." That was the first time since his death that the house felt warm again. The aftermath of Floyd Meyers Jr.'s story wasn't marked by vengeance or unsolved mystery. It was marked by echoes, the kind that linger long after the noise fades. His legacy became less about what ended and more about what endured. Compassion, community, and the relentless belief that no man is beyond healing. Because in the end, the Fresh Prince might have made Floyd famous, but the fellowship made him immortal. There's a quiet moment that comes after every great story, when the last frame fades to black and the audience just sits there, suspended in stillness. That's the feeling Floyd Roger Meyers Jr.'s story leaves behind. Not the jolt of shock, not the sting of scandal, but something gentler. A soft ache that reminds us what it means to truly live for others. In a world obsessed with fame, Floyd did something radical. He walked away from it. He stepped off the set, out of the spotlight, and into the real world, not to escape it, but to build something more meaningful. Where most people chase applause, Floyd sought connection. Where many measure success in money or followers, he measured it in hearts healed, in conversations that saved lives, in the small moments that never made the headlines. His life, and the way it ended, raises a question we rarely ask. What happens when the healer's own heart gives out? For 3 years, Floyd survived heart attacks that would have stopped most people in their tracks. Yet, he kept going, showing up for men who had nowhere else to turn, leading workshops, organizing wellness events, mentoring fathers who were on the brink of breaking. He was a man who gave and gave until there was nothing left to give, and then somehow gave more. But perhaps the lesson isn't in his death, it's in his living, in the way he found beauty in ordinary days, in how he spoke about pain with openness instead of shame, in how he refused to let his own struggles stop him from helping others face theirs. There's something hauntingly cinematic about that final night, the phone call with his mother, the laughter, the plans. No music, no warning, just life happening as it always had. And then, silence. It's in that silence we find the true gravity of Floyd's story. Because it wasn't just a sudden death, it was the culmination of a life spent pouring love into others. In every corner of Maryland, you can still feel the ripples of his impact. The Fellowship Men's Group continues his mission, now expanding into new cities, reaching thousands more men who might otherwise have suffered in silence. His family, too, has carried his torch, raising awareness about men's health, not just emotional, but physical. Because Floyd's story is a reminder that strength isn't about endurance, it's about balance. When you strip away the fame, the headlines, the nostalgia of the Fresh Prince, what remains is the image of a man sitting across from another man, saying, "You're not alone." That's it. That's the essence of Floyd Myers Jr., the boy who once played young Will Smith, who grew into someone far greater than any role he ever had. And as you think about his life, you can't help but ask yourself, how many people walk among us carrying invisible battles? How many give everything they have to heal others while neglecting their own wounds? Floyd's heart may have stopped, but the questions his story raises continue to beat in the hearts of everyone he touched. At the final footage, we tell stories like this not to shock, but to understand. To look beyond the headlines and find the humanity within them. To remind our viewers that behind every tragedy lies a thread of hope, resilience, and reflection. Because true crime isn't always about murder or malice. Sometimes, it's about the slow erosion of a life spent trying to make others whole. The quiet crimes of exhaustion, silence, and neglect that society too often overlooks. So tonight, as you step away from this story, take a moment to think of Floyd, not as a forgotten actor, but as a father, a son, a healer, a man whose final act was one of legacy. If his story moved you, let it also change you. Check on the people in your life who seem strong. Ask them how their heart is, not just emotionally, but physically. Be the voice that says, "Rest is okay." Be the reminder that even the healers need healing. And if this is your first time here, welcome to the final footage. We're not just a channel. We're a community of listeners, of rememberers, of truth seekers who believe that every story, no matter how painful, deserves to be told with dignity. Subscribe to The Final Footage for more cinematic investigations, real-life mysteries, and human stories that dig beneath the surface. Because sometimes, the most haunting footage isn't caught on camera. It's written in the hearts we leave behind. Floyd Roger Meyers Jr. Etusinde oni hundrade, otokfios totusinde, ofireoctive. You showed us that real strength is not in surviving every storm, but in teaching others how to weather their own. Rest easy, brother. Your work continues.